Right, thank you for coming and thank you for inviting me and hosting me. It's great to be here. I'm going to share with you some of my journey about cognitive load theory and how it seemingly contradicted the literature in gifted education. So first of all, I'm going to talk about why a focus or why an interest in gifted students, the models that are typically promoted to teach those students, how I found that differed from cognitive load theory and reconciled the differences that I was coming across, and some of the pitfalls that you can be aware of with teaching gifted kids, and some examples from our own school. So gifted students are really typically not thought about very much, have been in the past. There's a lot of emphasis on teaching the low-end students or resourcing them, but they are often overlooked. And we know from research that that can result longitudinally in really difficult problems throughout their lives. Of course, that's a missed opportunity for the whole of society to gain from their strengths. And there's a legal responsibility that every child should be entitled to learn at school. And this has recently been highlighted in New South Wales by a new education policy in 2021. Who do you think of when you think of gifted students? What do they look like? Well, their gifts are natural, they're natural abilities, so naturally strong, and here I'm just talking about intellectual giftedness, and they are the students that fall among the top 10% of age groups of their peers. So they're typically ones in the IQ scale who fall over 120, and if you include high performance and high potential students, they were the ones in the 85th percentile to 100th percentile in the IQ distribution. So in your school, you will probably have in your class between 1 and 5 of these students in your class, and maybe in your whole school you will have some couple of moderately gifted students, maybe up to 10 depending how big your school is. You will come across highly gifted individuals maybe a couple of times in your lifetime, and maybe never come across those exceptionally bright students. But we do have to cater for their needs, and they also have quite particular socio-emotional traits. And a lot of our programs, we run gifted interventions from kinder to 12, and it's aimed at keeping them in school a lot of the time. So they have heightened sensitivity, can be very emotional about things. They feel different from their peers, and they often exhibit perfectionist tendencies that can be really debilitating. They're really perceptive. You can't fob them off with easy explanations about things, even from year 1. And they often have a very strong sense of social justice and things being fair. And they have problems connecting with their peers, and a lot of the reason for that is because they might be very bright. If you look at this representation, if that ring is their chronological age, they have strengths academically, but socially and emotionally and maybe in their physical development, they are still an 8-year-old child or a 14-year-old child or whatever. So that developmental asynchrony means that they can find coping with those discrepancies really difficult. And even teachers can find that difficult, because if you have a really verbose and articulate child, teachers will expect more of them because they can do these things, but they can't actually necessarily regulate in the same way. And an example of that is this little girl, Esther, who did her A-levels when she was 8 and went to university. And then she started writing books on mathematics, and her books are called Yummy Yummy Algebra, because she's still 10, but she's capable of university level mathematics. So you can imagine how difficult this child finds it fitting in with her peers. The cognitive traits, let's have a look at their brains. Well, if we break down general intelligence into small blocks of cognitive skills, they have superior functioning and have been found to have a much greater processing capacity than their peers. They process things faster, so they learn at a lot greater pace, and they can transfer knowledge across domains much more readily than their peers as well. And we also know this from brain imaging studies, so that some of these have shown that there are differences in brain functioning in gifted students. And here's just one example of that. This is 4 areas of the brain that have been scanned during a task, and you can see that the gifted students, here labelled as talented, they are dedicating more resources to thinking and learning than their peers. So how do we teach these gifted kids? About 3 years ago, I was doing a master's in gifted ed at UNSW and examining all the different curriculum recommendations for teaching them. And most of these models come out of the United States, and they pretty much all promoted a highly inquiry-based methods to and no explicit instruction. And one of the models, the Maker model, there's lots of models of gifted education, but I'm just going to take an excerpt here from the Maker model, which is very popular and popular in Australia. It's very student-centered and driven by the student, and they are using methods of inquiry. So they want the student to be the expert and act like an expert in the field. There's often a focus on critical thinking and creative thinking, so lots of talking about problem solving and critical and creative thinking and solving problems by brainstorming. Using topics that are chosen by the students and methods and processes that they come up with themselves and real-life problems that are relevant to the student. And part of it obviously is about engagement, but they are also, this is the main curriculum methods for learning. They focus a lot on processes. So there's another couple of models, the school-wide and multiple menu model, and they talk about transfer between domains of knowledge and a lot of focus on self-actualization and development of skills really. And developing personal learning skills. There's not a focus on domain-specific instruction, so they're highly focused on making connections across domains and holistic, learning in a holistic way and not being constrained by any subject boundaries. The integrated curriculum model by Van Tassel-Basker is probably one of the most commonly used, and you can see it's split into 3 overarching pillars of the model, which are very heavily focused on inquiry and problem-based, project-based learning, researching by the students themselves, and looking at things at a very conceptual, high level, and also a focus on critical and creative thinking. And the William and Mary School of Education is held up as an exemplar for these programs. And you can download the programs from their site, and you can see it says specific teaching models are used to strengthen students' critical thinking skills. So there's a big emphasis on thinking critically and creatively. Here's an example for you, because I said most of these are operating throughout America, and this is one I picked from Nebraska. This is directly from their site. So they focus on teaching through an integrated curriculum where there's no subject boundaries. They use active learning, like activity-based maths and learning centers, cooperative learning. They're teaching attitudes and skills, making connections across domains and disciplines. There's a lot of focus on it being child-initiated and developed by the child. There's a critical and creative thinking again, and I'm not really sure what this means, but learning as a meaningful whole. It's a bit vague to me. But it's very much learning through projects that are initiated by the children, and the skills are being taught, very skills-based, and all the class members and the teacher as well are driving the topics and units of study. I also, while I was doing this, I was looking around at schools that I knew had implemented this sort of approach to learning and seeing difficulties in it, and there are a couple of things that I found most challenging, and one was having a very open plan learning environment, very noisy learning environments, but the second was having students coming up with their own inquiry questions when they really didn't have a lot of topic or content knowledge. Because either you would get a student saying they really couldn't think of any inquiry question, or the sorts of questions they were coming up with were very superficial and contrived. How does this compare with how humans learn, which is essentially cognitive load theory? And I'm sorry if I'm preaching to the converted here, because I didn't know how to differentiate what my audience was going to be like. But it's worth probably going through this little explanation of cognitive load theory while you've got this sort of information fresh in your mind, because I found it quite contrasting. So we know that there's an unlimited supply of environmental information that we need to transfer into our long-term memory for storage, which is also unlimited. But in between that, we have this bottleneck of working memory that can only hold and process 4 to 7 bits of information at a time. That's transferred through learning into long-term memory schemas, a store of information where we attach the learning onto things that we already know, building a body of knowledge. And that in turn is remembered to process novel information. And there's also a bit of forgetting there involved. But the bottleneck constraint is the working memory. Because of that, we need to teach novices and masters differently. And I pinched this from David Didow just because I really like Star Wars. And I think this is a great representation of sort of different stages of learning. The novice needs to use their thinking skills, whereas experts in a field use the knowledge that they've already got, their domain-specific skills. And if we think of a domain as this circle, and the circumference of the circle is the border of knowledge of that domain, the expert has all these little connected schemas, and they are thoroughly across that knowledge and can make connections. The novice, on the other hand, probably you can see there's about the orange connections. This is their extent of their knowledge, and they're still making those connections. At the very edge of the domain, that's where the expert is adding new knowledge to the field. Whereas back in the middle, the novices are still learning that knowledge. So at the edge of the domain, it's really a question of epistemology. Those people are generating more knowledge through inquiry processes. But I would argue that what we're dealing with our students, they're still novices really. They're still gathering and assimilating that knowledge. And what's the most efficient way to do that is the question. The experts have domain-specific knowledge that is already stored in their long-term memory, relevant to that domain. And the novices still need to learn that knowledge. And they do that through specific instruction, gathering that knowledge through worked examples, guided by their teacher, lots of retrieval, repetition. And I suppose the question is, where are our gifted students within that? So the novices don't have a lot of background knowledge. They're relying on their working memory, which is hard for them. The experts rather can gather they already have their background knowledge that they can draw on and apply that immediately. So they're relying on their long-term memory. The novices don't have effective mental representations yet. That procedural knowledge isn't automated like it is with the experts who have very clear mental representations and can draw on their knowledge bank to automatically see things that the novices can't. Our novices can't learn a lot when they're exposed to new information, and they see things very superficially. They can get overloaded quite easily, and they need really clear steps to follow for efficient instruction. And they can, be swamped. The experts, however, they can see the underlying structures when presented with a problem, and they can make those connections across different domains. Their problem solving is intuitive, and I think of those studies with the chess grandmasters when they can immediately memorize and see the layout of a board because it means something to them because they've seen it so many times before. So they don't get overloaded. They've already chunked and automated all that knowledge. Our novices can't transfer those principles to new contexts because they don't have those connections, and they learn best through explicit instruction. That's what cognitive load theory tells us. When you're an expert, you can make those connections between disciplines, and that's the best time when you should be learning through discovery approaches and methods. So how do our gifted learners learn? What's the state of play for them? Well, gifted learners have the same brains and the same brain function and structure as every other learner. So they're learning in the same way, and they still have this bottleneck of working memory that they need to assimilate knowledge through to get it into their long-term memory. And here's the conundrum, the dilemma that I came across. I know that explicit pedagogy is good, and that means we need explicit worked examples, lots of practice, lots of retrieval. But at the same time, as I was encountering the gifted pedagogy, which was promoting inquiry and developing skills rather than content knowledge, and focusing on processes, and a big focus on creative and critical thinking, which I would think comes at the edge of that domain-specific knowledge band. And having the children who are the novices, the students choosing the topics, how do you know what you're going to learn about when you actually don't know the bounds of that information? And I think it was summed up really by these couple of publications by John Sweller, who said the only way critical and creative thinking can be enhanced is by increasing domain-specific knowledge, because you can't think creatively and critically unless you've got a good content knowledge base to employ. And that using problem solving and inquiry learning as a teaching tool is inefficient, and it leads to ineffective learning. So I was really stuck then. What does this all mean? I know from the research on gifted students that they do accumulate knowledge faster, they prefer an accelerated pace, they learn new content quicker, and they need access to advanced curriculum. So we're pulling down content from higher levels to teach them. So some form of acceleration, telescoping, curriculum compacting, whole grade acceleration, subject-specific acceleration. They also need greater depth and complexity within the subjects that you're teaching them, and opportunities to employ those higher order thinking skills that you can get to once you have some knowledge base. And they need more abstraction, opportunities for abstracted thinking. So they need some enrichment too. And I can see that in the classroom, and you probably can when you teach them as well, that they require a much faster pace. They need to go, you need to let them loose sooner on their own problems. And I reconciled these two approaches really by looking at Andrew Martin's load reduction instruction. And if you hadn't read any of his papers, I would encourage you to do so, because I found this really helpful. And his model suggests that learners develop fluency through an automaticity, so they gain their knowledge in 5 sequential steps. First of all, by reducing the difficulty of instruction in the first stages of learning, and then providing lots of support and scaffolding for the students to learn, and lots of opportunities for practice and feedback from the teacher. Once they have gained that prerequisite expertise, they don't have that bottleneck of working memory. They can then move on to guided independent learning. And I think the word guided is key as well. They're not just left to themselves, they're guided by the teacher still. And that's when they can have creative and deeper reasoning, and they can be more independent in their learning. But if you provide it too soon, they just won't learn, they'll struggle. And I think this is probably the takeaway slide that I'd like you to remember from this. For our typical students that are learning, this pyramid represents the sort of area how we should be focusing our teaching. So usually the students should be spending a lot of time with the teacher teaching I do. What is the content that you're instructing them to do? And then some scaffolded opportunities to practice that before moving on to a discovery type project where you are the guide on the side and they are driving their own learning. With a typical student, that's the sort of distribution of time you might spend on an I do, we do, you do sort of model. For gifted students, that's reversed. The opposite is true. They need a lot less time on didactic instruction. They get terribly bored and frustrated if you keep repeating things again and again. They still need that opportunity to learn explicitly. It's just a lot smaller. And then they can move into that middle stage of you scaffolding and helping them become independent learners, and they can spend a lot more time on the guided discovery. So this model shows that really the way that you're accelerating through from novice to expert is just a lot quicker for these students. And something that I notice most in my classrooms is that the pace that you have to go with the gifted students is a lot faster. You might teach them a concept once and they have a couple of practices and then they're straight into the problem solving part. Whereas most students, they might have to do 10 or 20 examples, then move on, and your learning support students might need 30, 40 or 50. So the things to remember are they have a much faster transfer of novel information into their long-term memory. And that enables them to learn a lot more information overall, and that's why your pre-testing is so important, to know what do they know already before you enter into your instruction. They need fewer worked examples, and you can start fading that support a lot earlier and have a faster rate of support, faster rate of fading, and moving very quickly from the explicit part of your teaching onto more problem solving. So they're moving on to that guided problem solving earlier. And then they can spend more of their time doing those investigations and projects. I will just talk about some pitfalls related to that. Beware that gifties need explicit teaching too. So we run surveys of our gifted classes very often, and we have feedback for some of these students in classes that please remember that we need to be taught as well. Don't expect that we just know everything or come with knowledge. And that's through pre-assessment. Remove their scaffolds faster. So the hardest thing I find teaching them is the pace that they go. They are continually wanting more, and they love homework, and you just have to keep giving them more. So remove the scaffolding faster. And beware of the expertise reversal effect. So if they are not challenged, they can look like they're not performing. And very often if you do ability and achievement testing of your students, you will notice that a lot of gifted students are underperforming. And that might be because of the inadequate provision at the school, which you can do something about, but it's also because if they are stuck in classes where they are very slow, you get this expertise reversal effect. So once their level of expertise in an area has increased sufficiently through that explicit instruction phase, and they understand enough content, it's actually detrimental to keep teaching them through explicit instruction. They need to go off into inquiry learning. So if you look at any references by Cal Yuga, he's got lots of and very new publications this year on expertise reversal effect, which are great. And this happens, I can talk about this colloquially with a new Year 5 teacher I'm coaching this year, who is teaching a stage 3 class in maths. And he's a super explicit instruction teacher. And at the beginning of the year, it's his first year teaching these gifted students. What he was seeing was, Kate, these students don't really know how to do this, so I don't want to move on. But we knew from their assessments in the previous year that they were working at a Year 7 level. But because he was going very slowly, they had kind of switched off and weren't showing what they could really do. So you can see it anecdotally like that, and we talked about it, and sure enough, you speed up the lessons, you present them with more challenging problems, and they can get on and do it themselves. This is some data I have from a Year 1 and 2 class that I taught about 3 years ago. Whoops. So these were some students in Year 1, and these are their PAT results at the end of a year of teaching where they were allowed to accelerate through content. So you can see these are the regular Year 1 students in our class, in our school, and the Year 1 students that I taught in a pull-out class were working at about a Year 4 level by the end of the year, because we could accelerate them through content as they needed. I was moved off that class that year, and we had a new teacher come in who had an external consultant advising her on how to teach, who said, do not accelerate them, just provide enrichment. And they had already been working at a Year 4 level. So then when they were only provided with enrichment, this shows you, I put it individually because it's really interesting. The circle here shows the students who were in the accelerated class in 2020. The blue columns show their achievement in 2020, and nearly all of them declined in 2021, just because they weren't allowed to advance ahead. And these are some of their peers from the homeroom classes who all achieved a lot higher because the work was at the commensurate level for them. So these guys were given enrichment, but they just weren't allowed to accelerate. And to me, I'm looking at those results and thinking that's probably a really good example of expertise reversal. And I can show you that because they're all in Year 4 now and they're all doing really well, so I feel quite reassured. How does it look in the classroom? This is a sort of a direct instruction for a worked example that you could do for a novice. So working out each separate step of working and showing them how to do the worked example Whereas for a gifted student, you might present them a problem like that. It's still about how to solve an equation, but it's presented to them a little bit differently, so they have to think hard. Adding variations to your task, so in CLT terms, that's increasing the element interactivity. So your regular class might be learning how to find the volume of 3D objects. They might do 4 examples on cylinders, 4 on spheres, some on cones and cubes. Whereas for your gifted students, you would interleave all those examples to provide them with a bit more challenge. So they have to keep drawing on that knowledge of the different ways to find out the volumes of those solids. Adding variation to tasks, or the posh word for that, contextual interference. This is an example from PDHPE, where students in the bottom left-hand corner, you might start with them just practicing 20 throw-ins at the same distance, but to make it a little bit more difficult, you could have different things added, so different skills, throw-ins and passes and sprints, and have those from or you could vary the distance that they have to do those throw-ins from. Or you could complicate it more by having a combination of different skills at different distances as well. So it's adding more challenge. Rather than having to do more repetitions of something, it's adding more depth and challenge. Oh, where are we up to? Oh, this is about using higher order questioning. This is just a slide here because you can access these later about Socratic questioning. So that's designed to make them think more and challenge assumptions and clarify what they're thinking. How it looks, this is a year 1 and 2 class that I taught about belonging was the theme for the term. And your regular student might have a question like, what do belonging, community and diversity mean? These are little Kaplan icons. If you've ever heard of Sarah Kaplan's work, they're very helpful for thinking about how you can add depth and complexity to your programs. In the advanced class, they had to think about explaining how you feel when you do and don't belong. And then the higher kids had to think about, remembering that they're only sort of 6, 7, 8 when they're learning this, how do you know if you belong or not? What's the relationship between your identity and feeling who you are and belonging? And can you feel like you know who you are if you don't really belong somewhere? And they're quite capable of getting into these meaty questions even at that age. We went on to explore this about refugees. So I showed them this photo, and it was a zoom-in activity where I gradually released bits of the puzzle and they figured out who these children were. What's different about them and what do you see in our class? Your average student will just make a list of the different things. The gifted students have to make a Venn diagram that look at the different details and really look in detail. What's different about these children and ours, and what's the same? And then how do you think their environment affects them? What is it that's different about that? So they have to think a lot more and harder. And then you can add in some Socratic questioning about why the difference exists. And then interpreting things. What does the picture tell you about the children? You might just have a discussion about that in your class, but then you say, well, how does it tell you the difference? Yeah, they're dirty, they don't all have the same thing. Some of them are sitting on beds. Why are they in a tent? So it's adding those layers of question, and then layering on another level of thinking about why would the photographer do that? Why is the photographer positioned the child like that? What's the lighting like, etc. And then looking at trends. How many refugees are there in the world or in Australia? That's a little bit of independent research that you could ask a year 1 and 2 student to do. But for the higher kids, well, how's that changed over time? And what laws has the Australian government done about it? And they get, because they have a very strong sense of social justice, they get very involved in these questions. In fact, 3 of these boys made a video about this, and it won the National History Challenge this year, where they were being a little reporter reporting about refugee issues. And then so thinking about how the changing laws changes with the government and just adding on layers of complexity to make them think harder. And here's a secondary example that I put in to be topical. You could ask, compare Australia's COVID response to another country, but add a layer of complexity with, well, how does that change over time? and what are the different motivations of the different parties involved in this. How has each country responded, but how has each country responded then relative to their own medical system? It's contextually important. And from two different viewpoints. What would a medical professional think compared to Donald Trump, for instance? And which country's strategy was more successful? That's a straight black and white answer, but then you have to prove it with evidence and then suggest implications for future decisions. So it's ways of layering in complexity into your task. So all your students are working on the same thing, but your gifted children have a lot more opportunity to go deeper into that subject matter. So thank you for coming along. I think that's the key slide for me that helped me to reconcile those differences between a very inquiry-based approach, which is probably more appropriate for those students than direct teaching, but they are both important. And I think we need to start at one end and at the direct instruction end, and the way that you move through and the speed that you move through is really key, and knowing your students and understanding when to make that flip. And just before I go, I have to quickly give a plug. I was speaking with Tom Bennett last week, who's just confirmed that next 24th of August next year, we will be hosting Research Ed at our school in Newcastle. So please do all come. I'd love to learn what you're all doing and learn from your own experiences as well. Thank you.